Well, you wouldn't know it from the weather outside, but it is November.
There's another cold front coming later this week.
But it is still going to be almost 90 before the cold front comes. I only mention that because since it's a new month, we move on to a new letter, and we are quickly getting to the end of this. Yep. And so we've been working in this collection of letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that all come to the end of Paul's life. And you have split up the Timothys and put Titus in the middle of those. Yeah. And so, because we always blame Jeff for everything about the sequence, why don't you talk a little bit about why we're dating Titus in between these two letters? Why do you put it here?
Because both 1 Timothy and Titus, in both of those letters, Paul is still giving directions to underlings, to Timothy and to Titus, still very much focused on the work of the church, strengthening churches, and these types of things. Whereas when you turn the page to 2 Timothy, Paul is much more focused on himself and his impending death and personal instructions to Timothy. Paul recognizes that in a sense his life is over. He expects to die very soon, and so it's more tying up the things of life than worrying about or guiding the work of churches and his delegates on those issues anymore. There's such a different tone in 2 Timothy, and obviously, again, he clearly knows he's about to die. So life still goes on here in 1 Timothy and in Titus.
So, where are you gonna date Titus?
Yeah, that's hard, right?
Well, all of the dates are kind of hard because Paul doesn't write the date on the top right-hand corner of the page.
No, that's right, and especially, I think is most likely the case. 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy are after the book of Acts closes. So we have nothing else to guide us, outside of, some secular history and some traditions that come down this, but we have nothing biblical to guide us anymore in terms of the life of Paul. The book of Acts ended with Paul's first Roman imprisonment, Acts 28, and closes out there. So we just don't know for sure. In the book of Acts, the only time Paul has any dealings with Crete, it's ironically at the very end of the book of Acts, Acts 27, when he's on his way to Rome to be tried by Caesar.
Well, they got ahead of us there, right? Because we haven't talked about Crete yet.
Oh, sorry.
Throw up the map. So Titus is in Crete.
Yes.
When Paul writes this letter to him, he's working with the disciples there on that island, which is down here at the bottom.
The green one there in the middle.
Yeah. Fairhaven's is going to come up.
Well, I was about to say, and notice Fairhaven's on the bottom of the island in particular, because that's the thing. In the book of Acts, this is again where we're a little bit off the map here, pardon the pun now.
That was cute.
I know. You like that?
I did.
In the book of Acts, the only encounter Paul has with Crete in the book of Acts, he doesn't evangelize there as far as the book of Acts tells us. The only encounter is on his journey from Caesarea to Rome, which is even further past the map, is in Acts chapter 27, when basically it just says there in verses 7 and 8 that they came along under the lee of Crete off Salmone, and coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fairhaven's. And so, but there's no record of him evangelizing or doing much there. And so, presumably, either, again, after this Roman imprisonment, after Acts 28, after all that passed, he maybe either comes back to Crete or maybe just sends Titus outright. Maybe he was there in Fairhavens just long enough to do a little bit of evangelism before they kept on their trip to Rome. And now, either sends Titus, but we don't know. So Acts 28 is roughly about 62, give or take. So this is sometime after 62, but before Paul dies. And we can put Paul's death 65 to 67, 68. Again, hard to be dogmatic.
So somewhere in that window. 63
to 65, maybe.
Yeah, somewhere in that range. So either way, it is getting to the end, whether Paul senses that at this point or not. Yeah. It is getting down.
Certainly he does not have much time left.
So a little bit then about the background of the book. Mm-hmm. We should probably say a few things about what's going on. Of course, The first passage that comes to my mind is 1:5, where he's supposed to set in order what remains.
Yeah. This is kind of the counterpart to 1 Timothy 3, right? The end of 1 Timothy 3 we talked about last month.
They're kind of similar letters.
This is why I left you, and this is why I wrote you.
They're kind of similar letters, aren't they?
Agreed. Sending men to do the work of organizing and grounding congregations in various places that Paul can't get to anymore for whatever reasons.
And interestingly, in both of these churches, in 1 Timothy 3 and then here in Titus 1, there is this reference to elders and the need to put these men in place as part of, to use his language, setting in order.
That's right.
And I think illustrating the vital role of that. But it does make you think of 1 Timothy 3, and this is stuff related to the local church family.
Yeah, the household of God.
The household of God, yeah, right. What other background stuff would you add to that, though, other than this obvious thing up front, that Timothy's kind of organizing this local group on Crete? What else do you think is going on here that's important?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there's cultural issues going on, as is always the case in Paul's writing.
I think you're thinking about verse 12.
Yeah, that's right. 10, 12, and all through there. But even again, verse 10, you've got insubordinate, empty talkers, deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. And of course, what's interesting about that is that's the good old Judaizing teachers, that type of an issue that goes all the way back to January. Paul's first letter, Galatians, back in the late 40s. And so here we are, Paul's near the end of his life, 2 decades, give or take, have passed. And that old issue is still raising its head. And in a very odd place. I mean, again, we're talking about a relatively small island out in the middle of the Mediterranean. We're not talking about these bustling cities of the mainland across the Mediterranean. And yet that issue is there. But, it's a cultural issue. What do Jewish Christians, what do Gentile Christians do with the law of Moses, how they relate to it, and do you have to keep the law of Moses to be saved? Those are cultural questions that are, that false teachers are trying to turn into scriptural issues.
Do you think that could fairly be called the greatest issue faced by early disciples, the blending of the Jew and Gentile? That
Absolutely.
just seems, it just threads through almost all of these letters.
Absolutely.
And
the book of Acts,
and
too.
it's in Acts, right?
That's
that was the other thing I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Really, even before you get to Paul, there are those stories that lead up to the back half that focuses on Paul, where Peter is involved in the Gentiles. I'm not just talking about Cornelius. Even before that, you have this eunuch who is brought to Christ. And so, there are stories that kind of bring us up to the Paul's work among the Gentiles. But it just seems like that is their greatest struggle during their time, is bringing together Jew and Gentile.
Well, and even Acts chapter 21, the riot in the temple that gets Paul arrested, that starts his trip to Rome, that's the rest of the book of Acts in the first place, that creates that trip by Crete in Acts chapter 27. That riot is caused by a rumor spreading in Jerusalem that Paul brought Gentiles into the temple.
Right.
So again, it's hard to overstate for us now how difficult that issue was in the early church, but even just for Jews tolerating Christians, especially in Palestine.
I tried to get you down to verse 12, and you hung up there at verse 10.
Oh, the Cretans are always liars. Lazy gluttons.
I just assumed you were going to throw that in with the background there.
Well,
maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, the best part about that is a prophet of their own said it. Even the Cretans admit that the Cretans are troubled people.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, to this day, we even use that word Cretans sometimes. So it's spelled a little differently, but that yeah.
So that would also kind of say something about the cultural circumstances in which Titus is working.
Yeah, and thus, as to your point, that section, as that paragraph wraps down, verse 15, to the pure all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving nothing is pure, but both their minds and their consciences are defiled. This seems to be Paul's point to Titus about the kind of people he's going to be working with and among. And obviously trying to call either to the to obedience to Christ in the first place, or to if they're already Christians, to a better obedience, to a holier life than what that debased Cretan culture seems to involve.
It's interesting to me that if we're correct and this book is going to fall somewhere 63, 67, in that period leading up to ultimately Paul's death. It's the second to the last of the letter. Even if now he doesn't have a sense of death impending, certainly you're dealing, could we fairly say, with Paul at the height of his career. I mean, if he's going to die in 68, this is Paul as good as Paul is going to get. He's not a rookie at dealing with the Gentile controversy.
No.
How long has he been dealing?
His entire career, for lack of a better way to put it.
Which what I think would mean, coming into his dealing with Titus here, he's been dealing with this a long time.
Yeah.
He's highly experienced, even dealing with it among the apostles, with Peter back in Galatians. He's had a long time to wrestle with this issue and wrestle with churches wrestling with this issue.
Well, and to that point, David, while this was specific, the specifically first century aspect of this was how do we blend or not blend the law of Moses, the Old Testament, with Christianity under the New Covenant. Beyond that, what it still, I think, reminds all of us down to the 21st century, the jump we make to today, is that the challenge has always been in the church, and we've talked about this other times this year, but this just puts it back on the table. The challenge has always been in the church how to overcome racial and cultural differences, and how to allow people room to have their own, their own backgrounds and things, and not make what doesn't need to be made a spiritual issue into a spiritual issue, and not wind up, thinking that God only loves people who do it my way with my background.
Yeah, it's interesting because culture, when left to itself, goes back to this sort of tribal spirit, where we line up with people who, for whatever reason, whether it's skin color or country of origin or whatever you want to identify, part of the country you live in, tend to line up with people who are like them.
Yeah.
And so that pull of culture is always at odds with God's pull to take everybody and make them one.
Yeah.
And so maybe there ought to be some consolation as we read letters like Titus, that this has always been going on and always will be. Okay, so we're going to do our first read this week through Titus. Now, guys, this is a short book.
3 chapters.
3 short chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not like big old hefty Corinthian chapters. These are little short Titus chapters. And so this is a really easy book to read all the way through in one sitting. And of course, as Jeff and I always say, ignore the chapter divisions, ignore the verses. Just kind of sit down and read the whole thing. Read it through several times. Anything that would be good to watch for in your judgment as you read through Titus the first couple of times?
Outside of setting the church in order, I do think it's interesting that one of the differences between, the kind of things he's saying to Timothy and the stuff he's saying to Titus, I mean, some of it overlaps, like the elder stuff, there's some overlap. But this one seems to focus more on the nature of the gospel and salvation and what we're waiting for. This, we are saved from this sinful age, and we want to look forward to the age to come, and therefore, the kind of stuff he says in chapter 2, chapter 3, that this is what we've been saved for, to basically live godly lives in this present age. So there's more focus on living lives from the age to come in the present age in a way that's kind of got a little bit of a different tone than what Paul was saying in Timothy, which stayed so much more to local church issues. Yeah. This one's a little bit more individualized about the kind of person you ought to be.
Yeah. And so that was the other thing. You actually just jumped on the point I was trying to make, because you were talking about the gospel and what it is and what it produces in us.
Right.
But then he does seem to make this. It's almost like a James for local churches. It's very, very practical, and at times even very specific. I want to say something to men. I want to say something to women. I want to say something to younger people. I want to say something to older people. I want to say something to bond slaves. And so they're very specific instructions there about how the gospel is working its way out in your life and making you into a certain kind of person. So in that way, a book that will be loaded with application. So there's some stuff to think about and watch for as you're making your way through the first time. Remember, think about reading it all the way through. Don't break it up by chapters. Just read the whole thing at once. And I think you'll find it will speak to you in a different way when you read it all as a single unit. And we hope you enjoy your read this week, and jump in next week and we'll start talking about what the book is all about.